I'm Rod Suskin. Thank you so much for joining me here on my little world. Well, I've got so many interesting things to show you and to share with you. I'm an astrologer, I'm a Sangoma, I've been involved in all sorts of metaphysical and spiritual pursuits, looking for the answers as we always are. And I hope to be able to share some of those insights, some of those answers with you. We'll be talking to interesting people, we'll be going to interesting places, and we'll be trying the odd interesting thing. And that does not exclude some amazing recipes that will satisfy the vegan and vegetarian hearts in you, because that's something that's also important to me. Since the beginning of the year, this show has been airing on YouTube, and we've done some amazing things that some of you might have missed. Well, tonight I'm going to catch up with just a few of those things for you so that you can see a little bit about what Rod Suskin's world is all about, and so that you've got stuff to look forward to in the next few weeks. So stay with me as we look at a few different things that have happened on the show over the course of the year, just to give you a little taste of what goes on here. Now, some of you might be wondering, what exactly is an astrologer? Does that mean you write newspaper columns, and isn't that all a bunch of nonsense? Well, astrology is an ancient mixture of art and science that has stayed with us for over 2,000 years, and in fact is a very important way of how we've learned to see ourselves and how we've learned to contextualize ourselves in this strange and fascinating cosmos that we live in. Over the weeks ahead and the shows ahead, we'll be looking at astrology from all sorts of points of views. We'll even be doing some predictions every so often, and I hope to teach you more about what astrology is and why it's not such a good idea to dismiss it as some superstition or ancient, no longer relevant science. We still study it in some universities today. It's still as important and as popular as it's always been in some parts of the world. And despite the difficulties it's faced in Western culture, it still stands well over 2,000 years later. Certainly one of the ways we can understand astrology as modern people is that it was our ancestors' way of understanding how cycles work and how they relate to us. It's a very important part of astrology and can give us an enormous amount of insight into how social and political changes happen. That's something we often touch on this show. We'll be looking at what's happening in the world, why is it happening, what's happening to you, and what will happen in the future. But I received an interesting query earlier this year, from one of the YouTube viewers who wanted to know if Donald Trump was the new Adolf Hitler. Now, it might sound like a little bit of a silly question, but in looking at the answer to that question, it teaches us a little bit about how these cycles work, what's really going on, and why the world is in such a state as it is today, as we talk in the middle of 2016, seemingly on the brink of something. So watch this extract from a show earlier this year, see what you think. This is the cycle of the planets Uranus and Pluto, who, like any two bodies that we look at in space from an astrological point of view, are constantly in a cyclical relationship with each other, going round and round, forming various relationships with one another. And the cycle of social change is the cycle of the planets Uranus and Pluto. Last week I explained to you that the current cycle of social change, which comes up only every 35 to 45 years, is what's responsible for much of what's been going on chaotically in the world for the last couple of years, and promises a little bit more of that. Well, that cycle does repeat itself every 35 to 45 years and is really part of a larger cycle. And that cycle has a pulse of more or less every 35 to 45 years. For example, the last time it was around was 1966. And of course, 1966 and thereabouts was a time of enormous social change. The civil rights movement gathered momentum as we moved up to 1966. There was an incredible amount of chaos and protest, etc., associated with that change. So the main shifts and the extreme shifts come at these 90-degree points. In fact, Uranus and Pluto are at one of those 90-degree points at this time, which means that in 1966 they were at the 0 point, which is birth in chaos, if you like, as opposed to the extremes that are seen at the 90-degree marks. So the question arises, when were they last at their 90-degree point? And you won't be surprised to know that the answer to that is around 1932. That was the time before 1966 that Uranus and Pluto got together, and that's the last time since 2015 that they were at that extreme part of that cycle. Here you can see that cycle represented, and I've inserted onto that cycle the major events that lead to the complete seizure of power by Adolf Hitler. As you can see here, that all occurred during the dance of the 90-degree cycle between Uranus and Pluto. And of course, this is also the time of the great crash of the New York Stock Exchange and major financial collapse worldwide that would lead to essentially the modern economic system that postdates that. But let's put this current Uranus-Pluto cycle into perspective by combining it. Here you can see the two cycles next to each other. His agenda had been going on for decades. He was a long-time member of the party. He had been groomed to be in that position for decades. He had been through his mid-20s attempt to take over the parliament and then writing his book Mein Kampf. So in other words, he was extremely focused and extremely passionate about his racist and warmongering beliefs. Trump shows those things, but as we all know, he is a buffoon. And although it is wise to say, don't always be fooled by a buffoon, there's no doubt that a lot of his populism is through stumbling along, saying the next thing that attracts attention, saying things which are really calculated to provoke. Hitler wasn't calculated to provoke. He was an agenda. The things that he said had an intention and an end destination, where it does seem to me that Donald Trump is rather random and erratic. He's like an idiot that has been given the stage and he's just capitalizing on the populism. Let's remind ourselves that, never mind Trump in particular, the lesson from the similarity with the 1930s is that we are living in a world where extremism is on the rise, where populism is on the rise, and where all these extremes are causing conflict between people. That's what we need to be very aware of. In the 30s, it would lead to a war within 7 years, and there remains a danger that that is possible, given that it's the same 90-degree cycle and that the same form of conflict lies there, fortunately, seemingly not quite as the extreme. So keeping our fingers crossed on that one. Well, certainly, if nothing else, astrology gives us an incredible context for our times and a lot of better understanding of hopefully what we can do different, what we can avoid in the future. As the year goes by, we'll be looking at more of the exciting developments in our own elections, in the American elections, and the crazy state the world is in. But that's not the only kind of thing that astrology does. Astrology is also, of course, and perhaps more importantly, a very personal art and science. It's about people, it teaches people how to understand themselves, and also enables us to look at our own personal cycles and how things unfold in our lives. But in history, it's been used for even more detail than that, and has an important place in traditional Western medicine. Well, I've interviewed interesting astrologers who bring different things to astrology, and I'd like to introduce you to an astrologer who takes a very contemporary problem and how a very contemporary problem is dealt with, and that is fertility and infertility issues in couples, and uses astrology to help people understand their fertility issues and even to help them fall pregnant. Here's a little clip of that show with astrologer Nicholas Matz-Alsop. But I did want to start off by asking you, before we get any kind of technical about that, what kind of success does an astrological method have to help people fall pregnant? Have you had success?
I've had a lot of success, and some of the successes have been what I would call in the miracle territory, where I've actually felt anxious for the client or patient, but they've still managed to achieve pregnancy. It's also important to understand that astrology is not the miracle thing that's going to suddenly make you fall pregnant if you have got physical obstacles. So, for instance, no uterus, not going to get pregnant, no matter how much astrology you throw at it. People need to understand that. I think, if I can anecdotally report, that I'm 75 to 80% accurate in what I say about a person's fertility, in terms of diagnosing what it is that is stopping them from getting pregnant, and perhaps when it is that they might get pregnant. That's about the best that I could reassure people. I'm not suggesting that you use astrology instead of medical technology. I would like to see a world in where we use both together. I believe in a truly Platonistic style that we are a soul with a body, and that if medicine is just treating the body, it's only doing half the job. I think what we do as human beings is, firstly, we are designed to seek out meaning. Everybody, it just seems to be, one of those things. Human beings need meaning. And one of the ways in which we do that is we create narratives of self-identity, or narratives of who we are in the world. And sometimes we get too stuck to them, and sometimes they're really useful in helping us overcome issues and challenges and what have you. And I think that if somebody is going through the process of struggling to fall pregnant, it is useful to explore those narratives and see if within those narratives there is a way of realigning self-identity or finding new narratives for that person that still has meaning and resonance for them. You can't create fictional meaning or fantasy elements for patients, because that's not going to work. It'll work for a short period of time, but then obviously it will disintegrate. But you want to find for them and negotiate with them another story. So some people, like I said, have got wrong stories going on in their heads, and helping to unpack those and putting them on the right path and aligning themselves with the celestial sphere sometimes unlocks that time issue.
So more than just saying, here's a technical thing, here's a technical reason why you're struggling to fall pregnant, here's a date where it's a good technical time to do that. You go deeper and you actually look at those narratives about the issue of having a child, or why we're not having a child, or when to have a child.
Yes, one of the things that all of my clients and patients say is that when you are struggling with infertility and you go to a medical professional, you get 15 minutes maximum of that medical professional's time, and at no point do they ask you, what was your nurturing experience like? At no point do they ask you, what are your expectations as a parent? And they don't go to your intimate life. How is your intimate life going to suffer as a result of having children? So it is common. It's also 30% of the time when people are struggling, they are struggling with what's called unexplained infertility, where they are physically completely fine, but there's no reason why they're not falling pregnant. And that's the edge of the wedge where I want to work, where medical science doesn't have the answer. So it's clearly an emotional, psychological issue.
My world is not just about astrology. One of the things that's most important to me is spiritual enlightenment, spiritual growth, spiritual understanding. And I study many of the great masters, and will hope to share a lot of what I learned from them with you over the course of the weeks ahead. One of the questions that is so often asked of all spiritual masters or teachers and even astrologers is, why do we suffer so much? Why is Earth full of suffering? Why even good people get to suffer? So we did a show on suffering earlier this year where we looked at some of what a number of the masters said. And here's just a salient clip from that show that will give you some idea of what is the spiritual bottom line on suffering. Watch. One of the great masters that I've admired for many years is Ram Dass. Most of you know him. Formerly an American psychologist by the name of Richard Alpert, joined the spiritual path in the 60s, became Ram Dass, became a great teacher in his own right. But he had a famous great teacher by the name of Maharaj Ji, and Maharaj Ji said, Ram Dass loves quoting him, saying, I love suffering. It brings me so close to God. Because of course it is in our moments of suffering that we reach out. So not only suffering as grace, but literally suffering as a method or something that forces us to reach towards the divine. At essence, when you take birth in a body, you identify with this body and you think that this is reality. And that is the source of your suffering. According to Ram Dass and many Eastern masters, if you think that your body is the reality, that is the source of suffering. And ultimately, you suffer because the mind clings to things. It clings to youth. It clings to money. It clings to people. It clings to life itself. Ultimately, it clings to expectations. Expectations create suffering. But in the end, the Buddhist philosophy is that because life is imperfect, like Plato said, and changing, and pleasures and happiness are transient, suffering is inevitable. To attempt to remove yourself from that suffering, and at heart, a spiritual practice, especially one of meditation, is a process by which we start being able to detach from the need for outcomes, from pleasures, as well as giving us the ability to sit at and look at fear without actually engaging with it. One of the most powerful reasons we meditate. We shouldn't invite suffering into our lives, but when it does come, we must work with it to transform it, not use pleasure to try and avoid it. You know, when we're faced with the suffering of others, we look away because we are afraid to drown in it. But, says Ram Dass, you have to keep your heart open in hell. Because if you close your heart down to anything in the universe, it's got you, and then you are at its mercy. If you turn away from suffering, you close your heart and are at the mercy of suffering. What is the point? Why do we even live on this earth? The point is that by becoming compassionate and aspiring to non-suffering, aspiring to rise above it, to detach from it, we aspire to that true higher self, that true higher nature that is beyond birth. Spiritual lessons, not always easy to understand, not always easy to swallow, but always very liberating, free us of a lot of the weight on our shoulders. So over the course of this show, we'll be looking at many more such topics, and I hope to get your input on what you're interested in hearing about. But sometimes I get to go to amazing places in all the people that I interview. And earlier this year, I took a trip to the Transkei to see what's happening in the rural areas. And most importantly, to talk to White Sangoma Chris Ntombe Mhlophe Reed to see what it's like to be living as a Sangoma in the rural Transkei today. We had an incredible journey on that trip. And here's just a small sample of what went down. This area around the Sikisiki is more developed than I remember it being. But again, as we go further into the hills, we do see less and less of the modern houses, more and more of the wide open areas, and eventually into the small villages. We are headed to our first stop, which will be the village of Mzizangwa, where we will stay with our local family before we head deeper and further to our own homestead further into Pondoland the next day. We eventually reach the homestead of Mama Mabala, our mother and overseer here in Pondoland, who lives in Mzizangwa village, And you can see again tanks, square houses, even she's beginning to modernize. We got stuck in the rain here. The rain came and stayed for 3 days through the forest. Our first moment of pause is at the magnificent Magua Falls, the 142-meter waterfall, one of many waterfalls we actually visit on this trip, that falls down into the Magua ravine, continuing the Magua River, which will eventually actually flow right past our homestead down at the bottom. You can see this any hundred of times, and it is as breathtaking every single time I see this. That is our destination, the 4 blue houses you can see there. Later I went down to the Magua River, where I sat to interview Chris and Tom Reed. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, how did you even come to be in this incredible but very wild place?
Well, it's quite a long story, but I'm a white Sangoma trained in the Ponda tradition here in Pondaland, in a village called Mtambalala. I trained under a mentor, the clan of Klamini, and I went into training in 1993 and finished in 1997. Over the time of my training, I got to meet a Kwele, a herbalist, very famous herbalist, who was the chief of this valley, called Mdagan. And the homestead I stay in now belonged to his 6th wife, Mama Bala, who's now like my mum. And she moved up to Mzizangwa village after he died. And he asked her to leave me the homestead, because he knew how much I loved this place.
And the traditional culture, the traditional lifestyle, is it alive? Is it changing, or has it died out? I mean, times have changed.
Yeah, in this very rural area, it's still very much alive, but it is changing. And we've got electricity and roads being built, which is making a huge difference.
But I mean, surely that's a good difference. You can't expect people to live in the Stone Age while the 21st century is going on.
Absolutely not. Come on, Dad. I can't do it.
Yeah.
He's found some lost cows over here. That's fantastic. But all these improvements in people's way of life are coming to the hills. For so long, people had to fetch wood and carry water, and that's what everybody did. But things are changing, and it's a good thing. It's making life easier for people. And in the old days, not all the children went to school. They looked after the herds of cows and goats and things like that, and the girls stayed to help in the fields. But now education, everybody's going to school. All the children are going to school.
Baba abuyele kaya tung abuyele kaya tungulam sigolinga abuyele kaya tungulam.
I'll certainly be taking you back there, and hopefully we'll get to join a ceremony or two to see what Sangomas really do when they're not sitting around enjoying themselves at the river. We have so many exciting journeys ahead of us. Remember, there's even going to be the occasional cooking slot, the occasional really unusual thing that helps liven your world with a little bit of what I do in my world. So Here on Cape Town TV, we will be rescreening some of those shows, the full episode of the Transkei episode and so on, in the course of the coming months. But you can also visit the YouTube channel where these shows are published a few hours before they appear on Cape Town TV. So check it out, just search for my name on YouTube. You can also visit my website where you can learn a little bit more about me and my show and what I do. And you can also send personal questions. From next week, I'll be answering your personal questions again. Some of you might remember me doing that on Cape Talk Radio, where you can send a personal question about something that's unfolding in the weeks ahead, and I'll help you understand what's going on. So much to do, so many weeks ahead, we better get ready with the next show. So I'll see you all here next week, next Friday night, 7:30 p.m. on Cape Town Television. Don't forget, we're repeating on Sunday at 1:30 p.m. And of course, always there on YouTube, 12 o'clock Friday, where you get to see it first. Thanks everyone. See you there.